Yellowstone National Park is home to more than just geysers and cute little critters. It's also sitting on top of what could be the world's deadliest supervolcano. If it were to erupt, the explosion would be so big that it could potentially wipe out all life on Earth. So today we're going to talk about Yellowstone and some other volcanoes that could erase us from existence. Let's get ready to rumble. Yellowstone sits atop the hotspot of a giant mantle plume. As the North American plate slowly moves over this hotspot, the rock melts and creates magma chambers beneath the surface. Eventually, the pressure from the magma overcomes the weight of the rock above, and the result is an eruption. The largest eruption in Yellowstone's recorded history happened around 640,000 years ago, when the magma chamber beneath the park emptied in just a few days. In total, around 2,400 cubic kilometers of ash, rock and gas was shot into the air, creating the largest known eruption in the history of North America. A second smaller eruption occurred around 1,300 years later. Together, these two eruptions created the Yellowstone caldera, also known as the Yellowstone Supervolcano. But despite its ferocity, the real danger at Yellowstone might not be the eruptions themselves, but what happens afterward. You see, after the massive eruption, the ground above the magma chamber collapses. The resulting caldera is a gaping hole in the ground that stretches 43 by 28 miles or 70 by 45 kilometers. But because the sides of the caldera are still hot and weak, mud flows called debris flows can occur suddenly and without warning. During the largest historical eruption, these flows extended 180 miles or 300 kilometers from the caldera. And if something similar were to happen again, entire towns and cities would be wiped off the map. Luckily, there's no sign of any large eruptions happening anytime soon. According to researchers, the chance of a large eruption in the next 100 years is somewhere between 0.0002 and 0.0014%. However, there are plenty of other supervolcanoes that pose a much more immediate threat to human civilization. Located in the remote jungle markets of Sumatra, Indonesia, Mount Toba is the site of the most recent and perhaps most violent eruption in Earth's history. Around 74,000 years ago, the volcano blew its top and unleashed 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash, rock, and pumice into the air. This eruption was so large that it created a 100-kilometer-wide lake of molten material around the base of the mountain. But the real explosion came when this solidified lava dome collapsed and generated a pyroclastic flow so large that it stretched 100 kilometers from the volcano. For many years, scientists believed that this eruption was the reason why humans almost went extinct. While the eruption itself didn't cause mass extinctions, it did trigger a volcanic winter. The huge amount of ash and sulfate aerosols released into the atmosphere reflected sunlight back into space, causing global temperatures to drop by several degrees. For several years, it was hypothesized that this sudden temperature drop triggered a genetic bottleneck in our species, with the surviving population only numbering around 40 to 100 individuals. However, more recent studies have challenged this idea. They suggest that modern humans were already widespread across the Old World before the eruption, and that the population decline was probably caused by a more gradual climate change rather than a sudden volcanic winter. But whether or not it caused a genetic bottleneck in our species, Mount Toba certainly had a big impact on the environment. Studies show that the eruption triggered a mass extinction event in Indonesia. More than 90% of plant species disappeared, and it took 50,000 years for biodiversity to return to normal. And even though humans weren't severely impacted, we weren't completely unscathed either. Genetic studies have found evidence of a population decline around the time of the eruption. We may have lost 50 to 90% of our genetic diversity, which left future generations with fewer genes to adapt to environmental changes. To make matters worse, the region hasn't seen any significant decrease in volcanic activity since then. Mount Toba continues to rumble and shows no signs of slowing down. Scientists monitor the mountain closely because another large eruption could cause serious problems for nearby densely populated areas, Luckily, it doesn't seem likely that it'll erupt again anytime soon. Eruptions at Toba are fairly rare. It erupts on average every 500 to 700 years. And the last eruption happened in 1927. Of course, it would be a disaster if it did erupt again, but at least we'd have some warning. Small earthquakes usually precede large eruptions at Mount Toba, and these earthquakes can be detected up to a year in advance. Yellowstone and Mount Toba might be the most famous supervolcanoes in the world, but they aren't the largest. That title belongs to a volcano in New Zealand named Taupo. Located on the northern island of New Zealand, Mount Taupo is the youngest and most active volcano in the country. But don't let its relative youth fool you. The volcano is actually 26,500 years old. Over that time, it's grown from a small lava dome to one of the largest active volcanoes in the world. Today it stands 2,200 meters tall and has a massive crater that stretches 26 kilometers wide. But those dimensions pale in comparison to what the volcano once looked like. About 26,500 years ago, the volcano erupted with such force that it created a caldera 55 kilometers wide and 900 meters deep. Then about 1450 years later, the volcano rumbled again and created a new summit. Unfortunately, the exact size of this eruption isn't well understood because it occurred at a time when there weren't very many people around to witness it. All that scientists know is that it was enormous. In fact, the eruption ejected so much material that it made the surrounding mountains and valleys disappear. It blew away everything in a 100 kilometers radius and deposited layers of ash as far away as Australia, Antarctica, Japan, and the west coast of South America. And while it wasn't the largest super eruption in history, it was the most widespread. But enough about the size of the eruption. What would happen if it happened again? As you probably guessed, the entire region of New Zealand would be in trouble. Entire cities would be buried in ash, and many more would be destroyed by pyroclastic flows. It would be a devastating event for the country, and it would have major worldwide implications. Because the ash would spread so far and cover so much land, farmers would be unable to grow crops for years. The dust would block out the sun and trigger a volcanic winter. In short, it would be Armageddon for New Zealand and the rest of the world. Luckily, researchers say that it won't be happening anytime soon. Eruptions at Mount Taupo are fairly common. There's been 26 eruptions in the past 26,000 years, but the good news is that none of them have been super eruptions. Scientists do worry about a large eruption happening because there are more than 30,000 people living within 30 kilometers of the volcano. If it erupted again, they wouldn't stand a chance. But there's nothing quite like a close call to remind us how lucky we are. In 1980, Mount St. Helens in Washington state violently erupted. It was the deadliest eruption in U.S. history, and it changed the landscape of the Pacific Northwest forever. But what if something similar had happened in a more densely populated area? What if the same eruption happened in Seattle, Washington? Well, we can actually answer this question thanks to a research project called ST-SHAKE. In this simulation, researchers modeled various natural disasters as they would affect different regions throughout the United States. One of the disasters they focused on was a large volcanic eruption. In particular, they wanted to find out how a medium-sized eruption in Seattle would affect the surrounding areas. As you can see, the eruption blasts apart the city, obliterating everything in its path. Cities as far away as Portland and Vancouver are covered in ash, and millions of people would need to be relocated. It would be a devastating event that would kill hundreds of thousands of people and cause billions of dollars in damages. And the worst part is that it might be more likely than we think. The Cascade Volcanic Eruption Prediction Project predicts a major eruption in the Cascade Volcanic Arc every 300 to 500 years, and the last major eruption was around 1,500 years ago, so it's overdue. But maybe it won't be anything like the simulation suggests. Research is ongoing, and right now it seems like the risk of a large eruption is fairly low. According to the United States Geological Survey, the probability of a major eruption at any of the Cascade volcanoes in the next 30 years is less than 1%. So while we might be overdue for a major eruption, it doesn't look like we have anything to worry about. Well, except maybe for Mount Vesuvius. Unlike the other volcanoes we've discussed, Mount Vesuvius is an extremely dangerous volcano because it's located close to a major metropolitan area. It towers over Naples, Italy, home to more than 4 million people. And experts say that if it were to erupt again, the death toll could be catastrophic. And unfortunately, we have a pretty good idea of what this eruption would look like because we've seen it before. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Mount Vesuvius blew its top and buried the Roman city of Pompeii in ash. It also destroyed the nearby cities of Stabiae and Herculaneum, killing thousands of people. To this day, it remains one of the most well-documented volcanic eruptions in history. So what would happen if it were to happen again? Well, according to a new study, more than 3 million people would be directly affected. Whole towns would be destroyed in a matter of hours, and Naples would be buried under a thick layer of ash. The entire economy of southern Italy would collapse, and the rest of the country would be plunged into chaos. This eruption would be so devastating that it would affect the whole of Europe. Businesses would shut down, and the stock market would plummet. Fortunately, it doesn't look like we'll be seeing a repeat of this anytime soon. Mount Vesuvius hasn't erupted in nearly 2,000 years, and it tends to take breaks of around 1,000 years between eruptions. However, because it's located near a densely populated area, it only takes a small eruption to cause serious damage. In 1944, a small eruption at Mount Vesuvius killed 100 people. At this point, you're probably wondering what we can do to protect ourselves against a supervolcanic eruption. Well, for starters, we can listen to scientists and follow their recommendations. Not everyone lives near a volcano, but many people do live in areas that are prone to smaller eruptions and volcanic activity. When scientists warn you that there's a chance of an imminent eruption, you should probably heed their advice and leave the area. We can also learn from the mistakes of the past. Cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed because people thought that the small eruptions were harmless. It wasn't until the major eruptions that they realized how dangerous the volcano really was. We can use this knowledge to better prepare ourselves for future eruptions. Finally, we should continue to research volcanoes and improve our early warning systems. Thanks to modern technology, we can detect small earthquakes that precede large eruptions. We can also measure the rate at which the ground is bulging above the magma chamber. By studying volcanoes and implementing better monitoring systems, we can give people more time to evacuate and hopefully reduce the death toll in the event of a major eruption.